Hey everyone, Phil Randers here to talk about the biblical foundations for rule of life. As I talk about a rule of life, a question I often get is, so where do you find a rule of life in the Bible? And I got to tell you, if you're looking for the word or phrase rule of life in the Bible, you're not going to find it. But while there's no specific reference to a rule within Scripture, the idea of a pattern or a structure which shapes holy, faithful living, that is very much present throughout Scripture. It's rooted first in creation, in how God made the world, how he formed you and I. Genesis 1, think of that. It begins in darkness, in this unstructured chaos, unformed, unfilled. The Hebrew is tohu vavohu. And it's a phrase that signifies an environment that just can't support life. It's empty, it's unproductive. And the unproductiveness is related to its unstructured, to its disordered status. It's because there's no structure that there's no life. And out of this uninhabitable formlessness, God creates through this highly ordered, highly patterned process of 6 creating days. He orders the chaos into a good creation. He provides a structure, a rhythm for a habitable life of blessing and fruitfulness. And it seems so obvious, but the basic given of human existence is one of structure and pattern and order. And God's blessing is upon this structure and this order. This is where human flourishing is found. And to be without a pattern, without a form or a framework, is to live unproductive and empty. And so a rule of life, it's both an expression of and an alignment with these basic created realities. Now, moving beyond Genesis, you come to the book of Leviticus, that crazy book of Leviticus, which provides an early biblical example of what can be considered a shared rule of life. So Leviticus spells out in great detail an ordered life that is structured around fellowship with God, giving God's people everyday practices for life with God. Now you got to remember, Israel is fresh out of 400 years of slavery, and that 400 years has shaped everything about them, how they see the world. It's formed their identity. All they can see, all they can think is they are slaves. And so to disrupt those ingrained habits, all the ways that slavery has formed them, Israel needed a conversion, which is not only a change of heart and mind, but a change of practice, a change in a habitus, a conversion in a way of life. And so Leviticus outlines conceptually what is a rule of life, a detailed set of everyday practices that is meant to shape a new way of life, ordered now and oriented around God's reign and his rule. Moving beyond Leviticus, think of Daniel. Daniel, who was living in exile in Babylon. Remember, Daniel was one of the Hebrew captives who was shipped off to Babylon, and there he was subjected to this intense course of cultural instruction and assimilation in the ways of Babylon. But at 2 critical places in the Daniel story, we see a set of intentional practices. Daniel forms and he keeps a pattern of life, a rule of life, you could call it, which become critical to maintaining his distinct identity and vocation as a follower of the living God. The first happens in chapter 1, where we read that, quote, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Daniel avoids food from the king's table, and instead he asks for a simple diet of vegetables and water. It's just a small little act of resistance, an everyday act in his body that kept his heart centered on the one true God. And then a second example of this practice way of life comes from Daniel 6. Daniel's an old man, and it comes from the well-known Daniel in the lion's den story. At this time, the king of Babylon had banned all prayer except to the king himself. But what does Daniel do? Calmly goes about his regular life, the life that he has consistently every day lived. And we read 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. just as he had done before. This is a pattern that has shaped him, formed him. It is a regular, everyday habit. We see in Daniel this intentional pattern of life, now adapted for exile. But both practices of daily food and daily prayer, they have formed a rule of life of sorts, a pattern for Daniel to keep in communion with God. Going to the New Testament, we see the idea of a pattern or a rule of life in Jesus. Jesus, he was no somber ascetic, but we do see in Jesus a suite of regular habits and practices. The Gospels show that the life and teaching of Jesus both assumed and was marked by these practices and habits. For example, they include things like community, the relationships Jesus intentionally fostered, fasting, giving to the poor, prayer, solitude, submission, worship, Sabbath keeping. All these practices formed a way of life for Jesus. And the Gospels use this phrase, as was his custom. They use that often to describe just this regular way of life that Jesus lived. This habitus. It was a rule of life he followed. And then there's the early church. The 12 disciples had shared this life with Jesus, and now as the church grew to include over 3,000, a distinct, ordered life emerged that continued to cultivate communion with God and develop this identity of this new Jesus community. And we see emerging what you can think of as a rule of life, a pattern of practice for the church's early life. Acts 2 talks about this in verse 42 when it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. We see the church living out a well-formed Jesus habitus, a Jesus way of life centered on communion with the living, resurrected Jesus Christ. A way of life shaped by a practice pattern of intentional and shared habits that help knit the meaning of the gospel into their everyday lives. So while the phrase rule of life, you'll never find it in Scripture, what we do see coming through in the biblical story is the emergence of this structure for the fruitful formation of God's people and architecture of participation in God's life. Scripture presents the idea, the concept of a rule of life, this intentional pattern rooted in the creational realities of how God made us, a pattern that guides and supports the growth of obedient living through rhythms, relationships, and everyday practices. So that's where we see a rule of life in Scripture. Now, don't forget to check out the other resources we have at Habitus Community, where we want to help you with faith practices for everyday life with Jesus.